It's a great pleasure to present Paulo Lima, who is going to speak now. We are colleagues and friends from a long time ago. We studied together in the Nova University of Lisbon, and it is especially meaningful for me to present Paulo here in this symposium because he is the person who first introduced me to Hadot. He had 2 copies of What is Ancient Philosophy and a book on Marcus Aurelius, and he gave me the copy, one of the copies, which book, and I started reading Hadot because of him and his generosity. Paulo is an assistant researcher at Nova Institute of Philosophy in the Nova University of Lisbon. He teaches in the bachelor and master's degrees at Nova University of Lisbon in the philosophy department. He does research on ancient thought, Plato, the Stoics, Cynic and Tragedy, and contemporary philosophy, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Foucault. His most recent publications are Monstrous Emotions in Seneca's Medea. This is an article in Greece and Rome, and 2 forthcoming chapters in books. One is Figures of the Monstrous in Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, in a book called Nietzsche and the Politics of Difference. The other chapter is Quel rôle joue la vérité dans le mythe de Protagoras de Platon, un livro, in a book entitled La Vérité, Platon et les Sophistes. So he's presenting a paper with the title Discourse or Pure Visibility, a question concerning Foucault's latest account of Parrhēsia. So Paulo, you can proceed.
Thank you very much, Hélder, for your kind presentation and for reminding me of that special moment between us. Well, thank you very much, Hélder, and also Marta for inviting me for this wonderful symposium. I'm very, very pleased and honored to be among many reputed scholars on Hadot and Foucault, and it will be an opportunity for me to learn many things, I'm sure. So perhaps I'll begin with a little of personal history. My main idea at first was to focus on ancient Parrhēsia, on the notion of visibility in the Cynics, sorry, in Cynic thought. But as I was writing the paper, I realized that the problem I wanted to focus on was already present when Foucault talks about Socratic Parrhēsia. So I ended up talking only about Socratic Parrhēsia, and that's what I'm talking about today. So and for that reason, I've changed a little bit the title of my presentation. It is now From Speech to Pure Visibility: A Problem in Foucault's Conception of Parrhēsia. So in the guise of introduction, I'll say the following. So much has been said and written about the transformation that the consideration of Parrhēsia operated in the thought of the late Foucault, as well as the non-discursive dimension of political resistance in ethical life that Foucault highlighted through his analysis of Parrhēsia. Therefore, I would like to focus on something that, despite some initiatives on the part of scholars of ancient philosophy, I think remains much less discussed, namely the negative side of what I would call the ambivalence that characterizes Foucault's interpretation of ancient thought. So, without intending to reject the originality and philosophical interest of such an interpretation, nor being able to demonstrate how this negative side of its ambivalence ends up having a positive effect in heuristic terms, I propose to explore a particular aspect of this negative side, namely the philological and historical imprecision concerning Parrhēsia and the way of life it embodies. So this is my main point. I've written a longer paper, and I'm reading a shorter version of it. So I'll have to skip some bits of the paper. So the first section is entitled The Framework of Foucault's Analysis of Parrhēsia, because I think it's important to situate his analysis and from the start point out some difficulties that that the conception of this framework presents. So instead of carrying out a history of mentalities or a history of representations in its dual strand of analysis of ideologies and, quote, analysis of the representative values of a system of representations, Foucault undertakes a history of thought. That is to say, a history of the, for lack of an adequate translation into English, I'll say the word, I'll say the phrase in French, a history of the foyer d'expérience constituted by the articulations between three axes. Quote, the forms of a savoir possible, I don't know how to translate it, knowledge is not a good translation, the normative matrice of behavior for individuals, and finally, the virtual modes of existence for possible subjects, end of quote. This is from Government of the Self and Others. In the study of each of these axes, Foucault makes thematic and methodological shifts. As for the first shift, quote, from connaissance to savoir, from savoir to discursive practices and veridiction rules. As for the second, from the analysis of the norm to that of the exercises of power, and from the analysis of the exercise of power to the procedures of governmentality. This is procédure. As for the third, from the question of the subject to the analysis of subjectivation forms, I'm quoting, in order to, quote again, analyze these subjectivation forms through the technologies of the relation to oneself, or through what can be called the pragmatics of the self, end of quote. So it was as foyer d'expérience, composed of these three axes in their articulation, that Foucault investigated central phenomena in the determination of modern subjectivity, for example, madness, criminality, and sexuality. So this sort of recapitulation that Foucault makes of his own trajectory emphasizes its coherence and continuity. But at other times, Foucault accentuates or emphasizes the internal inflections of this path. For example, when he presents it as a study on the relations between subject and truth. So, quote, if at a certain point he formulated the question, quote again, in classical, usual, traditional terms, the question was, from which practices and through which types of discourse did one try to say the truth about the subject? He started to consider it more recently under another form, that of the discourse of truth that the subject is susceptible and capable of saying about himself or herself, end of quote. So this shift in Foucault's trajectory corresponds to a thematic shift to a new foyer d'expérience, more precisely, a shift from the analysis of the constitution of the mad subject, the delinquent subject, the speaking subject, the working subject, the living subject, to the analysis of practices such as the examination of conscience, the writing of moral letters, notebooks, among others, which amount to manifestations of, quote, saying the truth about oneself, end of quote, or the discourse of veridiction. The investigation into the composition of this foyer corresponds to what Foucault calls the study of aliturgic forms. A liturgy is, according to Foucault, quote, the production of truth, the act by which truth manifests itself, end of quote. Or more precisely, quote, and I quote again from The Courage of Truth, the type of act by which the subject, saying the truth, manifests himself or herself, represents himself or herself, and is recognized by others as saying the truth, end of quote. So because such a foyer determines the way of being of the elements that constitute its axis, Foucault refers to his enterprise as a history of the ontologies of true discourse, or a history of the ontologies of verediction, of truth-telling. When formulating the three decisive questions of this history, he highlights the ontological dimension of each of the three axes that constitute the new foyer. Quote, which is the proper way of being to such or such a discourse? Which is the way of being that this discourse of verediction confers upon the reality it speaks of? Which is the way of being that this discourse of verediction imposes on the subject who presents it? End of quote. So in the context of his research on this foyer, Foucault becomes aware that in ancient morality, or more generally in Greek and Roman culture, the principle one must say the truth about oneself assumes an enormous importance, having as its forms of expression various specific practices, such as the examination of conscience, the writing of moral letters, etc. For Foucault, the novelty of his understanding of these practices lies in the inversion of a general tendency, namely that they are anchored in the principle of know thyself. As the hermeneutics of the subject, and later the history of sexuality too, the volume 2, also indicate, Foucault believes he has found a more general principle of which the aforementioned practices, and even the know thyself itself, are examples, namely that of the care of the self. So on the basis of the multiplicity of manifestations of this principle in antiquity, especially in the Hellenistic and Roman times, Foucault acknowledges the existence of an authentic culture of the self, in the context of which the truth about oneself receives the support of the figure of the other and takes place, as he himself says, as a practice for two. So in the context of the late Foucault's understanding and its relatively unstable conceptual systematics, ancient Parrhēsia enjoys a peculiar status, not easy to identify. It does not seem to be a foyer d'expérience, as it is one of the modes of saying the truth about oneself, nor a mere example among verediction practices, as many of these practices are grounded in Parrhēsia. In any case, Foucault seeks to place ancient Parrhēsia with its intermediate and somewhat indefinite status within the framework of self-care, namely as one of the conditions for its execution, that is, for the constitution of an adequate relation of the subject to him or herself through the figure of the other. As Foucault maintains, I quote, with the notion of Parrhēsia, one has a notion that is at the crossroads between the obligation to say the truth, the procedures and techniques of governmentality, and the constitution of the relation to oneself, end of quote. This means not that Parrhēsia represents the most generic concept of which each of these three elements and their respective articulation are specifications, but that Parrhēsia is constituted as a particular modality of the intertwining of such elements. In other words, Parrhēsia is the modality of self-care in which saying the truth about oneself is constituted through a certain way of addressing the other and being before him, namely him or her, namely that of courage with regard to the problem of how to conduct one's life. So basically, it is another more complex and elaborated way of indicating that Parrhēsia corresponds to a modality of verediction about oneself, or, as Foucault points out, to one of the aspects, I quote, to one of the aspects and one of the forms of the dramatics of true discourse, end of quote, in which, I quote again, the enunciation and the act of enunciation will affect the subject's way of being and make the one who says the thing, actually have said it and be connected to the fact of having said it. End of quote. So Foucault's mention of the fact that the enunciation affects the subject's way of being directly links this passage to what we have already seen about the designation of Foucault's project as a history of veridiction ontologies and the three axes that compose the foyer d'expérience corresponding to veridiction. As a modality of this foyer, Parrhēsia can be understood, although Foucault does not use this term, as its another French phrase, as its sous-foyer, so to speak, composed of the same three axes, but specified in accordance with what we can call the subordination of Parrhēsia to veridiction. In his preliminary exposition of the notion of Parrhēsia, both in the penultimate and in the last lecture series at the Collège, Foucault considers its etymology and translation. Foucault draws attention to three linguistic elements related to Parrhēsia. Parrhēsia, as everyone knows, is the activity of saying everything. Parrhēsiazestai, the verb, means to say everything. The parrhēsiastes indicates the one who says it all, who says everything. Parrhēsia, the action it consists in, and its agent have to do with the idea of non-dissimulation. So this is a notion that is very often translated as frankness or freedom of speech, and during the Roman period had translations such as licentia, libertas, oratio libera, among others. But in addition to these basic linguistic data, Foucault points out the essential determinations of his own understanding of Parrhēsia. Quote, the analysis of Parrhēsia is, according to him, the analysis of the dramatics of the true discourse that makes the speaking subject's contract with himself or herself appear in the act of saying what is true. End of quote. So this contract or Parrhēsiastic pact of the subject with himself or herself implies a duplication or a reduplication or an affirmation of affirmation, in the sense that Parrhēsia represents, quote, a sort of formulation of the truth on two levels. First, that of the enunciation of truth itself. Second, that of the affirmation that one thinks the truth that one says. End of quote. However, Parrhēsia also involves the figure of the other, especially when considering the domains of direction of conscience, spiritual guidance, soul counseling, among others. As Foucault indicates, Parrhēsia is an element that qualifies the other who is necessary in the game and obligation of saying the truth about oneself. A virtue, another quotation, a virtue, duty, and technique that must be found in the one who directs the conscience of others and helps them to build their relation to themselves. In the Parrhēsiastic situation or scene, the other, the Parrhēsiast, is constituted through the aforementioned duplication in such a way that by enunciating the truth and connecting to this enunciation, the Parrhēsiast is even at risk of death. Foucault maintains, therefore, that, quote, Parrhēsia has to be looked for on the side of the effect of return that saying that saying what is true can produce, on the locutor from the effect it produces on the interlocutor. End of quote. Foucault's exposition of the fundamental features of Parrhēsia, however, presents some difficulties. The introduction of the figure of the other as a Parrhēsiast obscures the identification of the self of Parrhēsia as a modality of veridiction about oneself. If Parrhēsia represents a modality of this kind of veridiction, the Parrhēsiast should correspond to the self and not to the other. If the Parrhēsia consists in the other, Parrhēsia will not seem to correspond to a modality of veridiction about oneself, but only to a modality of veridiction, period. Since the other tells the truth about someone who is not himself or herself. With this lack of clarity about the self of Parrhēsia, a certain obscuration of Parrhēsia as such occurs, in my view, since it is not clear what veridiction it is in modality of, or about whom it says the truth. In their exploration of the common theme of giving an account of oneself, logon didonai, Alcibiades, Meyer, and the Lakis reveal the fundamental equivocality of Socratic veridiction, which takes two orientations: that of a metaphysics of the soul, ontology of the self, or cathartics of truth, and that of a stylistics of existence, or aesthetics of existence, or the courage of truth. Such equivocality is equally noteworthy as it corresponds to the opening of two fields of historical investigation, that of a history of the metaphysics of the soul, and that of a history of the aesthetics of existence, which in Foucault's perspective are, quote, the two main lines of evolution of the reflection and practice of philosophy in the West. So from this description, it is once again clear that Parrhēsia is a modality of veridiction about oneself, that not all veridiction about oneself is Parrhēsia, because among other things, it may not deal with the way of life, bios, and not involve courage, but rather focus on the soul, psyche, and requires the necessary purification for her access to the truth. In this sense, only one of the elements of what Foucault designates as the equivocality of Socratic veridiction, that of the stylistics of existence, represents a Parrhēsiastic element, and accordingly, only one of the lines of development of Western philosophy, that of the history of such a stylistics, is marked by Parrhēsia. However, this understanding of the history of philosophy seems to be contradicted by other pronouncements of Foucault's, according to which not only all ancient philosophy, but also all modern philosophy are manifestations of Parrhēsia, in such a way that the history of philosophy consists, I quote, in the history of veridiction practices, the history of practices of Parrhēsia, end of quote. In other words, one can, quote again, do the history of philosophy as a series of episodes and forms of veridiction, the history of philosophy, in short, as a movement of Parrhēsia, as a redistribution of Parrhēsia, as philosophy considered in what can be called its allocutory force, end of quote. This is from Government of the Self and Others, page 322 in the French edition. So there is an evident conflict between the two series of pronouncements, which does not contribute to clarifying Foucault's understanding of Parrhēsia. In the first series, Parrhēsia is one of the lines of development in the history of ancient and modern philosophy. In the second, it characterizes the entire history of Western philosophy, its two lines of development. In one case, it represents a modality of veridiction about oneself. In the other, it is synonymous with such a veridiction. Foucault seems to be using two contradictory, or at least different, concepts of Parrhēsia for the self-same function of what I would like to call historiographical category. So this is, I'll go to the second section. I hope I have time to read it. So Foucault, second section, visibility as a key element in Foucault's understanding of Parrhēsia. Foucault recognizes that Parrhēsia is a, quote, hard to apprehend, rich, ambiguous notion. It is a notion that in the long duration of its use in antiquity is characterized by the change, slip, inversion of its meaning, by its plurality of records, When considering this difficulty of apprehension, Foucault is basing himself on the presence of the notion in ancient texts. As he himself indicates, his analysis resorts to the, quote, occurrences of the word, to references to the notion, and to texts devoted to the notion of Parrhēsia, end of quote. Therefore, even when it comes to approaching the plurality of records of ancient Parrhēsia, its changes, slips, and inversions of meaning, in a word, when it comes to carrying out a genealogy of ancient Parrhēsia, Foucault seems to be trying to develop a philologically grounded genealogy. However, the fluctuations in the meaning of Parrhēsia mentioned above in section 1 are of a different order, going beyond what Foucault presents as the richness of the notion. On the one hand, if the elevation of Parrhēsia to a historiographical category is theoretically and methodologically acceptable, it cannot be confused with a historically and philologically grounded category. On the other hand, such fluctuations do not leave even a common formal nucleus of meaning, core of meaning, untouched that would allow us to use Parrhēsia as a notion that crosses ancient thought, and in this way would become the possible object of a genealogy. Without being textually grounded, or otherwise without at least operating with a notion that in its temporal duration preserves a common formal core or kernel of meaning, the project of a genealogy of Parrhēsia as a genealogy of modernity seems problematic. The fluctuation in meaning related to Parrhēsia appears in the very indication of visibility as a key element of that notion. The idea of visibility is implied in the definition of a liturgy as an act by which truth manifests itself. But where it is more present is in the framework of the stylistics or aesthetics of existence. According to Foucault, I quote, philosophical life as a stylization or embellishment of existence is a manifestation of truth, end of quote. And another quote, living philosophically is showing what the truth is, end of quote. Although the term visibility and the like do not occur in this definition, this idea is presupposed for a significant part of what is meant by manifestation or showing as a visual character. The fluctuation in meaning involves the idea of visibility on two interconnected planes or levels. First, visibility is metonymically transferred to Parrhēsia through the connection it has with veridiction about oneself, because, like Parrhēsia in one of the concepts of Parrhēsia used by Foucault, visibility represents a modality of veridiction about oneself, when the visible namely when the visible aspect of human life bears witness to its truth. Since Parrhēsia, in the other concept of Parrhēsia used by Foucault, is synonymous with veridiction, visibility, being equivalent to an element of veridiction about oneself, becomes an element, and indeed a decisive one, of Parrhēsia. Second, visibility, thus associated with Parrhēsia, becomes an element in the generalization process of the notion, ending up playing a key role in Parrhēsia as a historiographical category. The latter will be progressively identified with visibility until it has pure visibility at its core, disconnected from word and speech. When describing Socrates' attitude in the Apology, Foucault presents the philosopher as someone who, quote, is effectively, in his own life, an agent of truth, even in his own attire, end of quote. Through the figure of Socrates, Parrhēsia is defined as something, quote, that does not necessarily or exclusively go through this logos, this great ritual of language. Parrhēsia can appear in the things themselves, in the ways of doing, of being, end of quote. There are two aspects in this regard that should be considered as they point to the difficulties in upholding Foucault's thesis. One of them has to do with Foucault's use of the ergo-logo opposition to emphasize the factual component of what it takes to be Socratic Parrhēsia to the detriment of its discursive component. By emphasizing that component, Foucault does not give due importance to a fundamental point, namely that logos, when opposed to ergon, to refer to a discourse not put into practice, has a restricted meaning. This indicates that ergon is not opposed to all logos, and, as is the case in the opposition ergo-logo in the apology, can presuppose a logos, that is, a discourse that substantiates a determined factually adopted conduct. The other aspect is related to the fact that Socrates, in two examples of his conduct that he invokes to defend himself before the Athenians, namely when he did not vote with the majority in favor of the collective condemnation of the generals after the battle of Arginusae, and when he disobeyed the orders of the 30 tyrants to capture Leo of Salamis, acted according to a, quote, discreet Parrhēsia, because he did not speak. He tried to show it by his own actions. However, this is not Parrhēsia in a strict etymologically and philologically grounded sense, for according to the definition presented by Foucault himself, Parrhēsia refers to rhésis, speech. Therefore, when considering Socrates as a Parrhēsiast in the Apology, Foucault seeks to draw attention to the key role played by the visibility of his factual conduct, but comes up sometimes against the presence of a logos that prevents the occurrence of a pure ergon, sometimes against the requirement of a rhésis, that is, a specific form of logos, as a condition of Parrhēsia. Something similar happens when he considers Socratic Parrhēsia in the Laches. In his analysis of this dialogue, there is an express reference to visuality, to the idea that true discourse determines, quote, the visible figure, la figure visible, of human life. But the reference to visuality or visibility, better to a pure visibility, appears with great clarity when Foucault addresses Stesilaos' exhibition, arguing that this spectacle is placed in a dimension that is not that of verbal presentation, of the capacity to verbally present what one is supposed to be able to do. One is in the domain of proof, but of visual direct proof, end of quote, of which there are, quote again, eyewitnesses. Later, Foucault highlights the operatic character of the dialogue, as no true definition of courage was found. Since no perfect definition of courage was found, it is concluded that it is important to continue to resort to the true master, namely discourse, logos. Quote, that master to which everyone must listen is the logos himself, the discourse that will give access to the truth. Attending the school of the missing master, the logos, Socrates is the one who guides others on the path of the logos, end of quote. I'm almost finishing. This acknowledgement by Foucault of the role of logos seems to contradict the emphasis which, in the context of Stesilaos' exhibition, he places on the purely visible figure of life, bios. However, if one looks for what follows from this admission of the importance of the logos, one finds that Foucault does not draw any relevant consequences from his reading of the dialogue, ending his interpretation of it immediately after this. So these two positions of Foucault's point to a common tendency, although strictly speaking, they indicate different things. Indeed, if on the one hand, the interpretation of Stesilaos' exhibition refers to pure visibility, on the other, Foucault does not fail to recognize that logos is the authentic master when it comes to adequately defining courage, namely a courage that manifests itself factually, ergo, de facto. But in both positions, what he tries to emphasize is the decisive character of visibility in the constitution of Parrhēsia. Whether it assumes the logos as a determining factor of its visible figure or not, a way of life, a bios, once constituted in its visibility, enjoys, so to speak, self-sufficiency regarding the disclosure of its truth. There is at least another topic in Foucault's reading of the Laches that makes clear this emphasis on the self-sufficient character of bios, namely the Socratic requirement of giving an account of oneself, Didonai perihautu logon, which leads to the question, analogous to the ergo-logo opposition in the apology, of the harmony between discourse, logos, and life, bios. What this requirement tries to verify is, quote, what relation there is between the self and the logos, whether or not there is harmony between what the speaker says, the speech itself, and the speaker, end of quote. In raising this question, Foucault shifts the center of gravity of his understanding of Socratic Parrhēsia from discourse to the harmony between it and life, which he designates by reference to the plane of the senses. Quote, Socratic Parrhēsia, as freedom to say what he wants, is marked, authenticated by the sound of the life of Socrates himself, end of quote. Consequently, this harmony, symphonia, which sustains Socrates' Parrhēsia, does not lie in the logos, but in a plane autonomous from it, that of sound, phone, which is also seems to be self-sufficient in terms of the manifestation of its truth. In a context in which the notion of symphonia is at stake, Foucault replaces the idea of visibility with that of sonority, which in essence is equivalent to visibility as a non-logical plane, excluded from logos or different from logos, and self-sufficient in liturgic terms. So to conclude, I have made some critical observations on Foucault's interpretations of the apology and the Laches, which it is important to systematize and complete. And with that, I conclude. Therefore, unlike what Foucault ultimately maintains, there is a prevalence of logos over bios, not only because the logos determines the character of the bios, but also because the bios cannot be defined as something separate from logos as pure visibility or sound. So bios, way of life, is based on logos, on a discourse that consubstantiates it or that it presupposes. In other words, there are no bios without logos. There are no bios purely or directly, visually or sonically verifiable in its truth, as this verification, like the harmony between logos and bios, is only possible on the basis of a logos, a discourse that reveals the meaning inherent in a given factual way of life and indicates that it is grounded in truth, or in the case of the harmony between logos and bios, a meta-discourse that points out that such harmony exists. Furthermore, neither bios by itself, which cannot be without logos, nor all the modalities of didonai perihautu logon, of giving an account of oneself, due to the polyvalence of the term logos, correspond to manifestations of Parrhēsia. As I mentioned, bios always involves logos in such a way that as an instance that provides direct proof of its truth, it is a philologically and historically unfounded notion. And even if one accepts that it is a philosophically defensible notion, it is not combinable with a philologically and historically grounded notion of Parrhēsia, as this refers to rhésis, speech. On the other hand, if, in accordance with historically and philologically grounded notion of bios, the latter is understood as something that presupposes logos, it is not always equivalent to a parrhesiastic activity, since the logos that is involved in it is not always a rhésis, a speech, more exactly, a speech addressed to the other in a risky situation, that demands the courage of the truth. Logos, the discourse that justifies the bios, can also be an explicit logos in a safe situation, or an implicit logos, Plato speaks about it frequently, or an implicit logos in which the conception behind a determined factual way of life, although being present, is not externalized. Thank you. Sorry for taking so long.
Thank you very much, Paulo.
Well, thank you for listening.
And since you started 10 minutes after the hour, I'll also give further 10 minutes, so we have 20 minutes for discussion.
Oh, I'm relieved. Okay.
Yes. So are there any questions from the speakers? Fábio?
Hello, Paulo. That was very interesting, and there was quite a bit of overlap between what you said and what I'll be talking about later today. And I must confess that the interpretation of Foucault's interpretation of the Laches, especially that what you mentioned about the thing about logos and ergon and the idea of visibility, etc., is something that never ceases to baffle me. It's interesting, but it just baffles me in the sense that how you can read it in that specific way. I mean, how Foucault could read it in that way. The thing that piqued my attention near the end of your paper was when you talked about Stesilaus in the exhibition of Stesilaus. And this is not so much a question, but an observation. You could actually read and interpret the exhibition of Stesilaus as one of those events that is the bearer of implicit truth claims, of an implicit logos. Mm-hmm. And if you look at it as not merely as an exhibition, a random, unattached exhibition, but rather within the dramatic context of the dialogue, the obvious truth claim that is at the heart of the exhibition is, this is something that is important. This is something that will help your children attain arete, etc. And that's an important, crucial truth claim that basically frames and supports all the rest of the dialogue. And to look at it as mere visibility is ignoring something that is structural to the dialogue itself. Yeah. Would you agree with that? Or
I would totally agree with that. Thanks very much. It's very useful. I don't have any remarks to that because I totally agree with you. So it's evident for me that there are implicit truth claims or implicit logoi involved, because otherwise you would be separating Stesilaus' exhibition from what follows, which is a discussion on courage. What is happening is that with Stesilaus' exhibition, it becomes possible to have a discussion on courage by pointing, for example, to Stesilaus' example. That is courage, and this is not merely deictic, but involves logos, the demonstration.
You remember that the Laches' criticism of Stesilaus actually hinges on the fact that in the battlefield or in the naval battle, he is actually quite poor. He doesn't behave as a warrior should.
So there's also a great warrior, but he isn't. So
exactly.
That's not really true courage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Daniele, I don't know if you are there. We cannot see you. Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks so much. I mean, I have many questions, but perhaps two brief kind of suggestions or remarks. The first one was about kind of I always thought that there is a tension between Foucault's characterization of parrhēsia as a form of erudition in terms of telling the truth about oneself, and the specific kind of way in which, you know, the specific form that this telling the truth about oneself actually takes, right? Because Socrates doesn't necessarily tell the truth about himself, right? Or the cynics, you know, like they don't do that. So once again, it seems that is something that is more connected perhaps to the kind of Roman care of the self, where there is a sort of diagnosis of, you know, like, oh, you know, here are the things that I'm still not good at, here are the passions that I still have to fight against. Whereas, you know, it seems that there's a shift, and I was wondering whether the focus on visibility that there is, that kind of takes more prominence in Foucault's account of parrhēsia in Socrates and the Cynics can also be connected to the shift away from the description of parrhēsia as truth-telling about oneself, to the shift to you know, a notion of parrhēsia in which what you show is still something about yourself, the relationship between what you think, what you do, and etc. But you know, in which you're not really telling a truth about yourself. You're more you're trying to tell a truth about the other rather than about yourself. So this was the first kind of remark, and I was curious to know your thoughts about this. And the second one, I mean, it was more at the beginning you were saying, you know, you were planning on talking about the Cynics, you know, like, and then you kind of focused more on Socrates. Something that has always puzzled me, if you take Foucault's one of Foucault's main claims in Discipline and Punish, the way in which visibility becomes a trap, you know, like the total visibility becomes a trap, and then at the end of his life you have this form of parrhēsia in the Cynics, in which total visibility is you know, is the mark of something that Foucault seems to want to valorize. And I kind of, you know, that's a question that has always intrigued me. This kind of this change in the value of total visibility that you have in the two contexts. Of course, the two contexts are two different historical contexts. But I wondered if you had anything, you know, like to say about this, or if that's something that might be interesting to explore more in your paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniele. Well, most certainly, because thanks very much for all your suggestions and questions. I think I will start by the last one, because it's a really interesting remark, and it's done in the spirit of trying to link the thought of Foucault's thought as a whole, and that's the thing. That's something I think it's lacking when it's still lacking when one talks about the late Foucault. I think there are many continuities between the initial phases of his thinking and the late phase. So and that points to that clearly points to that. But it surprised me. Your remark surprised me a little bit, and I don't have anything to say about it. But I will think about it, because I think I think we can find many things there. But still, it's very important to point out that link. As to your first remark or question, yes, of course, that's one of the points. Socrates does not tell the truth about himself, but that's one of the points I've tried to make in my paper. Of course, one could try to do a reading of Foucault in order to try to make the most sense of his interpretation, and say, well, Socrates is not directly speaking about himself, but he's talking about the life of others, but the lives of others are human lives, and so indirectly Socrates is speaking about himself as a human being, so to speak, as a psyche in the Socratic Platonic sense. But still, this is an indirect form of speaking about himself, and the difficulty I find there is that it is very hard to consider this as a sort of as a Parrhēsia, because it's not a direct address of a certain subject so that's what and another point that I was trying to demonstrate in my paper, and I think this has to do with your second remark or second question, is that Foucault has two concepts of Parrhēsia. One which we could call philological concept, grounded in the texts, and another concept which is a more historiographical concept. And one of the things I tried to do is to try and see what mechanisms lie behind this sort of elevation of a philologically grounded notion to a historiographical one. But what happened? But after this sort of step is by Foucault is complete, what happens is that Foucault is playing with these two notions as if it were just one, as if they were just one notion. So and what ends up happening is that Foucault starts to see at some point starts to apply the historiographical notion to the texts, as if this notion was present in them, and I think that it's not. So and he starts talking about the Socrates and the Cynics as if they were pointing to this Parrhēsia, which is synonymous with visibility. But if we look at the text more carefully, it's not what's happening in them. So
thank you. Thanks so much. Perhaps there's something that could be said. I think that Foucault is writing two genealogies when he talks about Parrhēsia. One is the genealogy of the critical attitude, and the other is the genealogy of avowal that goes towards Christianity. So perhaps that's also a way in which you can think of the difference between these, these two notions, or these two perspectives, or like the shifts. But okay. I'll shut up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and Federico.
Okay, thanks for the exciting paper. Daniele, in your response, in your reply, also Paulo, you anticipated a lot of what I was going to ask, but I'm going to ask anyway. So basically, I think that there was something very nice in your presentation, which somehow relates very well to the discussion before about Parrhēsia and rhetoric, which was the way you situated Parrhēsia as a case of a broader sort of set of practices, which is the care of the self. So in 82, Parrhēsia appears as a way to take care of the self in relation to others, right? And Foucault mentions the Epicurean context. There's a whole discussion of the direction of the student who has to somehow be guided by a master and so on. So it appears in that context. So that it was interesting. And I would add to that also, maybe complementing this discussion that you were having with Daniele, that it is not only Parrhēsia as a case of the care of the self, but it's also Parrhēsia as this instantiation of a broader history that Foucault is writing, which is a history of the relation between subjectivity and truth, right? So both avowal, and Parrhēsia, for example, are, let's say, cases of that history of the relation between subject and truth. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why what you said now happens, that he sort of gets carried away by this notion of Parrhēsia, which is somehow projected upon this text because it embodies so well a certain form of relation that's specific to antiquity of subjectivity and truth. Okay, so that was more of a comment. Now, I have also a question, which is the relation between what you're saying of sonority and visibility. And if we take seriously this idea of, you know, a relation between subjectivity and truth, is it the same kind of relation between the subject and the truth that we see in the forms of visibility of the cynics, for example, and in the kinds of sonority where there is a symphonia between life and logos? So that's the first point. The second point is it the same experience of truth itself that we're talking about here when we talk about sonority and logos, you know, we talk about visibility, when we talk about this life, you know, if you think of The Courage of the Truth, Foucault speaking about the existence of the cynic as this performance, this scandal of the truth or in the truth. Is this the same as a truth that I find in philosophical logos, right? So maybe a way to answer to this, and I'll stop very, very soon, is that there are different ideas and notions of truth here. I think you mentioned the truth about oneself and the truth and the philosophical truth, but also the truth of a philosophical doctrine as well, right? Philosophical truth understood as a certain doctrine that one internalizes through practices, et cetera, which seems, you know, it's present in Foucault, and it's perhaps much more explicit in Hadot, which we haven't spoke of yet. But yeah, just throwing these elements out there and see how you would respond to them. Thanks for the paper, it's very stimulating.
Thank you very much, Federico. There's a lot there to unpack and to talk about. I'll just start by commenting on your comments, on your initial remarks. Well, to be more precise, that's one of the points I tried to make. Parrhēsia is, I mean, the status of Parrhēsia is sort of it's kind of obscure, as I tried to show, because I think that Parrhēsia is not a foyer d'expérience on the one hand, but it on the other hand is also it's neither an example of a practice of a philosophical practice, because it's not on the same level, conceptually on the same level as other practices, because the other practices which are mentioned by Foucault are grounded in Parrhēsia. They involve a truth-telling, a veridiction, right? So it's not. I mean, it's not wrong to say that Parrhēsia is a practice, but one should complement that remark with this. Its status is indefinite in some way. It's not on the same level as other practices mentioned by Foucault. The second remark had to do with the question of the relationship between subject and truth. Well, it's true, as you said, that the project of analyzing Foucault's project of analyzing Parrhēsia is part of a broader project, which has to do with the study of the relationship between subject and truth. But what happens when Foucault, as you said, is carried away by the notion of Parrhēsia, is that the analysis of Parrhēsia becomes the project itself, and this becomes confused with the project of the study of the relationship between subject and truth. And that's not quite rigorous, so to speak, because that's not what Foucault, that's not the way in which Foucault presented this project of studying the relationship between subject and truth initially. So there's a change here, there's a fluctuation, and this fluctuation obscures what Foucault is trying to say and do, in my view. There's no total clarity on this point. Let me see. Well, you've made two.
With sonority and visibility, because in the experience of truth, that's
of course, they are. I mean, visibility and sonority could be understood as forms of truth. I mean, conceptually, but this leads us to the perhaps to the discussion between whether truth is propositional or non-propositional, whether you can say that I'm having access to truth when I directly and purely look at something, or when I directly and purely hear something, or whether I have to presuppose some kind of logoi in the Greek sense in order to assess what I see and hear in terms of its truth. So there's a of course in the history of philosophy, and specifically if you look at Plato's dialogues, there's a tension between these two notions of truth, and ultimately this is a controversial point. Ultimately, Plato has a notion of truth which has to do with pure visibility when he talks about the direct access to the ideas. And in that sense, but ironically, what Foucault is trying to do is somehow similar to what Plato was trying to do in this particular regard. So, so there's a discussion between these concepts of truth, but in the context of what I mean, with regard to the text that Foucault is considering when he tries to draw attention to this notion of truth as visibility, in those texts, the truth is conceived as having an intrinsic relation with discourse. So in that point, I think he's not reading those texts quite correctly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because you remember that in The Courage of the Truth, there is this idea that the cynic, there's a very sort of economic cynic doctrine. You don't find a corpus of doctrines of the cynics, but still they're doing philosophy. And they're doing philosophy because they embody something, right? And they're doing, and I would translate using your term, they have a certain form of visibility that expresses a relation to the truth. But it seems that logos or logoi, as we understand here, and seems to be absent in that sort of, or at least occupies a very secondary marginal position in that sort of embodiment.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to ask you to be brief.
Yeah. I'll be very brief. I will just answer this remark by Federico. Well, I think for that purpose, for the purpose of understanding what is happening in the cynic attitude, we can use a Platonic concept, the Platonic concept of the implicit logos. No matter what kind of life you're conducting, a philosophical one or a common one, there are logoi implicit in that way of life, which are functioning, functioning, as Plato says, hopis tenemon, behind us, without us seeing them. So what this means is that no matter what kind of life you're conducting, that kind of life is interpretable in logical terms. Logical here meaning by means of logos, by means of a logos. So that's what I think is happening. So it's not important if you have an explicit doctrine grounding your actions, functioning as the explicit reason for you to do X or Y. Okay, in a philosophical way of life, that's an important element, but it's not the exclusive element, because in the final analysis, you could think that you are acting out of a certain ground, but you're not. You're actually acting on other grounds that they are not explicit, or that you are not conscious of.
Thank you very much, Paulo, for the presentation, for the
Welcome.
Discussion, and thank you for the questions. We'll
you.
finish here our first section, and we will resume our work at 2 o'clock in Lisbon time, and the equivalent for each one of you. So see you soon. Have a good lunch.
Have a nice lunch.